Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Codingo, the Global Head of Security Operations here at BugCrowd. Going to do a presentation today on Recon specifically. I'll cover some bugs class elements that I think are important, but the principal focus of this is going to be Recon. Whoop, not letting me progress in slides. There we go. I work for BugCrowd. You're probably already aware of us, given the registration was there. We're a bug bounty platform. Essentially, my role here, as of a little over a month ago, I took over management of the triage team. Before that, I was the head of researcher enablement. I come from the crowd. I was a top 50 researcher on BugCrowd before I joined. And before joining BugCrowd, I was a penetration tester for NCC Group. So coming from a heavy technical context, and I'm aiming to expose some of the things here that over the last year, when I was working as a pen tester and I was heavily hunting, the things that really stood out to me and the things that I feel everyone should be aware of from 2019. You can probably hear in my voice, I am a little bit sick at the moment, so do bear with me. There might be periods where I have to pause. I will try and mute if I'm coughing or anything like that. So I do apologize for that, but we felt it was important to proceed here, given that we had such a heavy interest in this talk. Right off the cuff, I want to point out that this talk is based on my opinions, they're not facts. So I'm highlighting the tools that I think were the most notable in 2019. That doesn't mean that they were the best ones in 2019. That merely means these are the things that really stood out to me. There could be things that I wasn't aware of, or there could be things that you might find are better for how you like to hunt. So this specifically was catered to the things that I feel the things that had the biggest impact on me. I am focusing only on open source. I'm not focusing on any commercial tools. And so for that reason, there's some notable tools that came out last year, notable additions to tools that aren't covered, such as Turbo Intruder, for example. I'm aware of those, and I felt to make this talk as accessible to as many people as possible, to purely focus this centered on what's arrived on GitHub. And so for that reason, this isn't complete in terms of the number of things you can add and improve on your tool set, but it's complete in the sense I feel of what was available on GitHub. So diving into that, the most notable changes as a holistic view, not as a specific tool view over 2019, we saw some significant changes in brute forcing, specifically directory brute forcing. That's continued into 2020. To kind of touch on that, like FFuff, for example, has gone to version 1 this year. I do cover that in this talk. I think that's definitely a notable change that's happened since the window of what this talk covers. There's a lot of push for working at scale in the bug bounty community specifically, and in many parts, the penetration testing market is making some moves in that direction as well. And so there was quite a lot of release and different authors working on that particular space. And so we'll touch on that. And there's also been a further focus on the cloud, both in the forms of subdomain takeovers and S3 bucket detection and things like that. So we will cover that also. But these are the 3 points that over 2019 I felt made the biggest difference outside of specific research. There's some notable authors as well that do pop up through this talk, but I also recommend looking at essentially all of their work. The two that come to mind are Tom Nom Nom and Albino Wax. Both of those people made a very big presence throughout 2019. And I couldn't feature all of those works, but I do strongly recommend if you wanted to take some of the contents of this talk to do some further study, that those two people are the two that you focus on. So let's start. Directory brute forcing, as we mentioned. There's some notable exceptions here. I've tried to go with 2 tools that I felt were the most impactful, at least in terms of my hunting style. GoBuster had a 2.x release that I'm not going to cover, but is worth a look if you use GoBuster. So Firefart that wrote WP Scan teamed up with OJ Reeves, and they did a massive push to get to a 2.x release milestone. As stated earlier as well, I'm not covering Turbo Intruder here, but that's definitely worth looking into for this space. So those two takeaways, I'm not going to be covering those, but the two that I am going to be covering is one that has got a lot of noise, but I think is important to cover is, sorry, the first one has got a lot of noise, my bad, is FF. So I'm going to quickly start. The videos that you'll see in the background aren't specifically for me to reference there to give you a bit of insight into the tool as I talk. FF specifically, actually, sorry, one sec. There we go. I do apologize. I didn't realize how that skipped. It should have started the first video. So I'm going to cover the first tool. Reconnaissance, sorry, hasn't got a lot of attention. It's essentially a recursive brute forcer, but it does things a little bit differently. So it uses head-based checks to speed up content discovery. So essentially, you're getting a very, very fast brute force in a recursive fashion. The limitation by which, because it's using a head-based check, it's sending two requests. So you do hit WAF bands very, very quickly. And it is doing spidering by looking for additional links within the HTTP response and doing some things like that. So it's got some really clever tricks to it that if you're not pushing against a WAF, you know, like outside of bug bounty context, if you're a penetration tester on an internal, this was my go-to tool. I used to use FF as my first point of call from an external perspective till I knew what was going on. And then I would cut over to Reconnaissance if I wanted to do that further check. You can see on the screen, the speed's quite good. It's a tool that, you know, has that interesting difference in check, but you've got that limitation of the WAF ban. You need to be quite wary of it. And it's also not as actively maintained now. I know Sisto personally, and I believe he's looked at throwing his lot in with the FF project. I'm not sure where that's quite landed, but I know he and I spoke a while ago, and he felt that project had hit on a lot of the points he was hitting on. So that, you know, in the broader sense, FF is the primary tool I would be looking at, but I think it's worth exploring and seeing if this is something of value to your workflow. And as I said, it hasn't got a lot of attention, which is surprising to me because of the value of the speed behind it. And then FF, this tool has got a lot of attention. If you're not aware of it, I strongly recommend looking into it. It's one that I suspect we're going to have around for a very long time. It's very actively maintained. It's very well maintained, and it's been managed in a way that is extremely modular, so you can push it into other projects. The author is a part of the community, so he's joined Bug Bounty Forum and other places, and he's been quite active on Twitter. You know, he's aware of community requests. I worked with him to run a bug bounty, just an ad hoc Twitter bug bounty for a feature, and that worked really well. He was very receptive to that. And beyond that, the flexibility of the tool is amazing. So you can use it to check for virtual hosts, you can use it to check for directories. But if we quickly pause the video here, you'll see on this last command line that ran where it says google.com/fuzz. So in essence, wherever that fuzz word is, it's going to replace the terms with the terms in the word list that you fed it, which is the one under common.txt. And so there's a lot of flexibility in that. You can pass it a request and you can fuzz any element of the request. So if you're checking for, like I said, a virtual host, you could just replace the host field, which is great. So given that flexibility, you know, you might want to fuzz a file name or a file extension. It's very quick using FF to change and modify where you're fuzzing against. It's a tool that, you know, I think out of anything that's been released in recent times for bug bounties, I think is the one that's most likely to be that mainstay that everyone has in their workflow. And I don't see another tool kind of coming out of nowhere to bypass this, because this has been done so well and is so actively maintained. It doesn't look like this is a project that's kind of going to stand still. So, and even, you know, since I've done this video, the changes have been pretty significant since. There's been a whole 1.0 release done this year. That's brought a whole new raft of things around, such as there's now a request import feature that mirrors very much what you would do in SQL map to pass over requests. You can now do the same with FFuff. So you can do your SQL map checks with a request, and then you can pass over to FFuff and do additional checks. So there's some very elegant approaches in workflow that you can find on this. I'm intentionally not covering how I use it in workflow because I don't think it's exceptionally flexible for others to apply. But I do strongly recommend going over the documentation in full and having an explore with this and working out how it sits for you and exploring further. And I'm quite happy to answer questions on these at the end as well. The next thing, and I know I'm mostly covering Recon, but this is one that had a lot of space in, is XSS specifically. And the first thing I really want to call out, and I'm going to produce a reason to not do this after this and a solution to this problem, but I feel that it's still very prevalent for people to jump directly to an alert one. So when you explore an XSS vector, alert one, and when you're learning XSS, alert ones are often the core way that these are taught. And you go and you learn XSS challenges and you'll see, hey, pop alert one on these 50 challenges, and you'll learn different bypasses, different techniques. The significant problem with this, and as someone that manages a triage team for a bug bounty platform, I can definitively say that you are earning less money if you just rush and you submit this first, without question. There's a number of situations where, like let's take the substantial base of an XSS. It's a P3, and like a reflected XSS. It starts as a P3, but there could be situations in the website where there's a way that you can pass it to an admin and there's no password reset functionality, for example. So you could do an account takeover to any account, including an admin, by creating a XSS payload that resets the password. Or even on a smaller scale, let's say there's not such sensitivity in the thing that you're testing, you could do a full page redress to better demonstrate that issue. And now why that's important, even though that may not impact the value as much, is it increases your value as a researcher, which increases your trust with the platform. Because when a program recipient receives a report that's an alert one, essentially what you're expecting is someone who is potentially technical or potentially not to be able to go to their business manager and get the capital to pay your finding, as well as get that solution in play based on an alert one, versus the difference of an account takeover or a page redress or some other element that properly demonstrates XSS. As security professionals, when you've studied it, you understand the impact of XSS. And although a lot of developers will, a lot of developers still don't. And like I know there's probably some pushback on that statement, but I have managed development teams before I moved into pen testing. I can tell you that I managed a lot of developers that had very limited awareness of this. They knew what XSS was, but they didn't know the full implications of what could be done with it. And so I really want to encourage, and I'm going to go into some solutions to this, but with your learning on XSS, don't stop at alert one. Start to pursue, explore your knowledge of JavaScript, learn how to explore these vectors further and other things that you can do with it. And then, see if before you go and submit it, see if there is a way to turn it into an account takeover, because not only is that going to give you a higher priority, you're also much less likely to dupe. It's well worth exploring further. So on that note, there's been some push on this in the space as well. So Hackloop pushed out last year an excellent repository called the Weaponized XSS Payloads repository. And that has a number of pre-built templates in it. One to help you with the more generic CSRF bypass. And then there's some Drupal and some WordPress payloads that you can create automatically. So when I've been hunting and found a WordPress website and I found XSS, I would create the create admin payload. Now I wouldn't exploit it on the program because I would be creating a new admin, but I would send to the program, if you visit this link, you should see this admin user created with this password. Because essentially what that payload does is it allows you to quickly generate your own create admin payload where an administrator would visit that link and a new administrator would be created in the backend, which you could then use to completely take over the website. So the program in mind, you probably won't be able to fully do that, but you can create the payload and give them the instructions to verify, which triage would work with the program to do that. That's been expanding since. If you do have your own templates you want to give back to community, I really encourage that. Um, there's also a second one that's specifically tailored to WordPress by Hudua, that has further extensions and further things within that. Plugin installation, for example, malicious plugins in WordPress can lead to RCE and some other implications. And so, those things are, I would, if I had to say directly, which I think is more bug bounty appropriate, I would say the weaponized XSS payloads one is. The admin call payloads are more tailored to the penetration testing market. And although you could use them to enhance a bug bounty report, it's probably better to create a lighter payload to demonstrate the issue on an account takeover using the weaponized XSS payloads as the first call out. But that's not to say you couldn't go and create a report that also included, hey, you could do this plugin installation flow as well. So both very important repositories, both help you to push past that alert one in a variety of situations with a variety of platforms. And it's also worth, even if you're not on a WordPress site, taking a look at how some of these are put together and the kind of things that they're doing, because that could guide, your knowledge and your learning to be able to do this on more bespoke systems. So another exciting point of change, subdomain discovery, which was also the flavor of 2018. So 2018 saw the arrival of Subfinder in a mass, which was a very big leap forward. Before that, the bug bounty community heavily focused on Sublister, which at this point in time, if you're still using Sublister, I very, very strongly recommend revisiting this space and having a look, because it's changed dramatically, to the point that I would say you're at a very, very big disadvantage still using Sublister today and not exploring other. It's not if you're using it with other tools, but if you're exclusively using Sublister for your subdomain discovery, it's no longer maintained, and it's lacking a lot of the recent innovations that Amass, Subfinder, Find Domain, and some of the others that I'm going to cover have brought to this space. In 2019, in 2019, with Amass getting as many changes as it has, and it added some resolvers and such. And so I'm not going to cover Amass because it didn't release in 2018, but if you're looking in this space, I recommend looking into that as well. So that's part of the OWASP project, AMASS. Vortex and I put together a tool to allow you to discover and maintain additional resolvers, and so we worked with some other hunters to get some tricks for this. So Europa was very key to providing us a lot of insights into different things that we should be checking, essentially to find lists of resolvers and clean out malicious DNS resolvers. So one thing I don't think people quite realize until you start to run a tool like this, and you'll see some of these start to get rejected soon, is that when you go and build lists of free resolvers, you end up with a lot of resolvers that poison results. And so you can see one there where it says the error DNS poisoning detected in passing. Some of these poison in some really unique circumstances as well. So I've been running this tool recursively for about 6 months now, and it still cleans resolvers out that have been good for months on end and then suddenly turn into a malicious resolver. And I'm not sure if that's like they're set just to do it for a small window or different elements of that, but it's poisoning your results and it creates false positives and all sorts of issues. So this tool, DNS Validator, was designed to accept lists of these resolvers and clean them up. So then you could feed them to tools like Subfinder and Amass to do DNS resolving with your large list, but knowing that you have a clean list of resolvers. So although not directly a subdomain discovery tool, I do think this is an important cornerstone of that workflow and something that you should have in your toolkit to help guarantee purity of results and accuracy of results. Additionally, the other, not so much a tool directly, but the Rapid7 DNS dataset is a dataset that, if you're not familiar with it, is I think it's larger than this now, but approximately 22 gig dataset of information regarding DNS on the internet, and there's a free version and a researcher version. I recommend applying for the researcher version if you're a penetration tester or someone that's got an account with a firm that can justify it. Very, very useful. The free version is still updated quite regularly. But the DNS grep project came out last year, is a project designed to allow you to quickly parse it. So for context, the Rapid7 DNS dataset is 22 gigs of RAR text file content. So it's very, very slow to grep over and search on that data. And you can find a lot of existing projects before this arrived that were built, essentially shell scripts for searching over that data. If you're still doing it that way, I mean, if you've got a workflow that works, then it's great, it does work, but you won't be able to scale that and it is very slow. I recommend looking at deploying DNS grep into that workflow. And essentially what DNS grep does is it will pre-process those results in a way that you can do a sub 10 second, normally within a second or two. You can see the runtime on this one was 0.14 seconds to query the data set that you've downloaded. So you can see the file names there. This one was built off a 29th of March data set for the results that you pass it. So if you're looking for subdomains, you can see the query at the top there is .secdocs.com. And so then it's looking for the subdomains related to that. But I could also remove the dot and look for like domain names, which can be really useful for certain targets. It can be really difficult for others. So if you were to look for walmart.com, you'll get a ton of false positives of people that have built similar domain names. But if you look for .walmart.com, you'll receive all of the subdomains of Walmart because it's specifically looking for that dot within the query string. So, if you're not using that data set, really recommend that after this talk, you go and you take a look at it. It's a quick way to get a lot of results back. A lot of people have it in their workflow, and it does provide additional level of coverage. And then this project, I strongly recommend putting in just for the speed of consuming that data so that it doesn't become a bottleneck in your search. And another arriver, so specifically now on tooling, so we've covered Amass and we've covered Subfinder. A new entrant kind of popped up last year, which is written in Rust. And it had a bit of a shaky start, but it's really kind of found its stride now, and particularly in 2020. I've been watching this one closely, and I feel it's really leapt forward a lot, is FindDomain. So FindDomain is another subdomain tool it's aiming for speed. I still think there's some question out there about in terms of the quality of results. And so, if you are looking for subdomains, you should be using multiple tools anyway. And it's notably should be mentioned, Amass continues to be iterated on. Subfinder came out with a new release in 2020 as well, and continues to be iterated on. And likewise, this one continues to be iterated on. So in order to get the best results, you should be using all of them and combining that result set. However, if you are looking at doing something quick and you're not looking to wait, say you've just got a private program and you're just looking to move quickly, you're not too interested in the depth of results in that first pass, FindDomain is a really good starting point for that because it does work very, very quickly. And it does get quite a good amount of results for the speed that it runs at, which a lot of that I believe can be attributed to the fact that it is in Rust and it is designed with speed in mind. So it does appear to have taken that into consideration with the way that it approached the various sources. And so this was a new entrant in 2019 to that space, continued to be maintained into 2020. And I think another one, much like FOF, is here to stay. I do think this is another one that's here to stay and worth adding into workflow and worth exploring further. So another area that's been iterated on is API keys and build logs. Both build logs, both for finding new endpoints and exploring, and API keys. It was always something that people were doing. It's not like it was a new bug bounty finding in 2019, but it's something that we started to see much more focus on. And to that end, the most notable way I feel that kind of shifted, Streak put this repository together called the Key Hacks repository. This is a repository that, and for disclosure, I do help him to maintain this. However, it is his effort that goes into it. That essentially has a number of API endpoints and how you can safely exploit them to verify the validity of those keys. So if you discover an API key for example, you're doing your recon, you're going down an API and you see that, or you say we'll use a better example, sorry. You've decompiled an Android application, and in doing so, you've found this weird branch of code that's got an API key in there, and you think it could be sensitive. Key hacks can, if you can identify the key, help you to then see how others have exploited it. And I say exploit in the generic sense because it's the word, but to verify it would be the better word, because they are designed to be safe verifications. So, they're not designed to be intrusive tests of those, and it's a really reasonably strict mantra over the repository. So this is great if you want to provide a demonstration and create a submission of, hey, I believe this could be used to do X. I've verified the key with this, so I know it's valid, and the discussion can kind of flow from there. It can be much better than, like, say you get a Slack webhook, you don't want to be spamming the channel and trying to figure out if it's valid. You can start to use those endpoints and go, okay, cool, this endpoint is valid. Likewise, there's checks in there to help you with Google Maps, for example. So Google Maps, in the triage perspective, is very often a false positive. People often see the API key and response, and they'll go and report that, not realizing that often it can be correctly controlled to not allow public access or off-domain access. So there's checks in there to allow you to properly verify that. So this repository, in terms of less so recon, but in terms of your hunting, is one that it should be a reference point and a key way that you approach API keys, and one that you save and reference to regularly. If you work in triage, it's one you should be well and truly aware of. It's a very key cornerstone project. And then on that note, so at Overflow and a number of others, there's a great blog post, which sadly I haven't referenced here. I wish I did actually at this moment, but they did this really awesome blog post last year on how they were exploring build logs for these kind of keys. So as a point of example, what they discovered was that on a GitHub repository that was using Tavis CI, Tavis build logs they have IDOR by their very nature. And so this tool was built by Corbin Leo that allows you to download all of those logs, and then you can pass over them using various greps to discover API keys. So these are false positive results. I'll be really clear there. This is just for the sake of example of what could be done. There isn't any keys in here, but you can see, like, grepping over the results allows you to grep over every single build log that ever ran over the repositories tied to GitHub organization. So you point it at a GitHub organization, it'll find all of the repositories that have Tavis CI attached to that, and it'll download all of the build logs associated with that. And then you go and you grep over that, you look for keys. And additionally, you can look for new domains or new subdomains. So you might find staging or development environments that you weren't aware of before. And so this approach, there were very likely people doing it before 2019. However, that blog post really made a shift in focus, and it's something now that is in a lot of people's workflow and should be in your workflow. It kind of brought it front of mind, and this tool is the key thing that kind of has driven that at the moment. There are some others that have popped up. So I know other build systems have been explored, but I really feel this is the one worth highlighting and the key cornerstone. If you wanted to look into it further, I would look into other build logs, other systems. I don't think there's a tool for every system yet, so you might find there's some new edges there, which is a bit of a hint. There are tools for Circle CI out there already. I still feel they've got some improvement, some work to make, so I haven't featured those for that reason. So that's a space that is kind of waiting for the right move and the right person to come along. So on that, the right tool essentially needs to take the same approach here. You can point it at a GitHub repository and get the build logs, or an organization, get the build logs for every repository in an organization. And the key reason for that is if you're hunting something as large as Facebook, for example, or even, a lot of companies that just have a lot of repositories, you don't want to be running this tool against 100 repositories. You want to run it once, and then you want to process the results in bulk. And that's what this allows you to do. So for me personally, the way I've approached this, I have a shell script where I've just written a heap of greps. There's another project by LC that you can see. I forget the name. I will check while I'm talking. That essentially allows you to create those kind of queries much quicker as well. Maybe not LC, sorry, I can't remember at the moment. But yeah, you should be exploring grep as a means of making this process as streamlined as possible. Three projects that I felt didn't quite fit anywhere else. They weren't quite up to an entire area of their own, but all the same, I really wanted to cover them. So they do have a place in my workflow, and I think they're important to be aware of. So Dr. Watson is a Burp Suite extension released by Prodigy SML, also known as SML 555. And so it has a number of regular expression checks within it that allow you to have Burp Suite checking for and identifying assets, keys, subdomains, those API keys we were talking about just before. As you're exploring an application and walking an application, or even if you bring up a site and you spider, it'll be running those checks over the responses that are coming back. So really, really useful to help ensure coverage. And I've found API keys in this that in some really weird places that turned out to be valid findings, as well as finding new domain extensions and new subdomains and areas that I probably wouldn't have found as easily otherwise because they were referenced in comments or elsewhere that wouldn't then pick up in Burp Spider the same. So that's a great one to add. I do believe it's in the B App Store. If it's not, the process for installing those is relatively simple. You can clone the repository and then add it to your Burp Suite. You will need to have Burp Suite Professional for that, I believe. However, it might work with free. I didn't verify that before this, so. Jenkins, much like Secrets, which we covered, and also by Corbin Leo, is the same approach. However, it's receiving every build for every job within a Jenkins instance. So if you do have a Jenkins instance, instead of having to visit all of those, you can point this tool at it, download everything, and then process the results locally with your own grep scripts and other variety of instances. And so really worth having in your workflow for those instances. And likewise, JLoot, it's a different approach. It's not quite the same, but allows you to enumerate attachments of Jira tickets. So if you find an open Jira instance and you're trying to identify what the impact is for your report, you would be typically looking at attachments for that to see, what are they doing here and what kind of things they're going to add some punch and some substance to this to help to identify impact. And so that's a really useful way to optimize that workflow. And again, one worth having in the toolkit. Both Jenkins and JLoot, you're not going to hit them all the time, but when you do hit those instances, there's significant time savers and the kind of things that you want to be aware of so that when you do find that, to go and point at it. So it's worth having a good note system for that same reason. I have all of these things organized. So if I find a Jira instance, I can pull up my Jira note sheet and it's got a reminder, hey, you need to go and use JLoot, and this is what you've done in the past with it. And so that's the kind of process you should be adding and identifying these tools for those edge cases. So cloud-based services, this has been a really interesting space for a while now, but particularly last year, we saw a big shift. And the most notable and one probably the most referenced repository in the bug bounty industry is the Cannot Take Over list, which came out last year, or just before last year, sorry. It came out at the very end of 2018, but it's notable enough that I've made an exception and put it in this talk. And so if you're not aware of what a subdomain takeover is, it does explain it on the repository, but essentially with a whole heap of services, including a whole heap of services in Azure and some services in AWS, when you set up a service and you remove it, but you don't remove DNS, there can be services that are vulnerable for another user in a different account to recreate it in their own instance. So for an Azure website, for example, I create the DNS record to it, and then we decide that marketing campaign is over and I remove the Azure instance, but the domain team hasn't yet removed the DNS record. In that interim, the subdomain takeover situation can occur where an attacker or someone comes along and recreates the CNAME for that service in another Azure account. And so those CNAMEs aren't protected. They're not bound to account. They can be recreated anywhere. And so what the Kano takeover list aims to do is to document services that are vulnerable and not vulnerable, as well as if you collect the discussions, you can see the discussions around it for reproduction steps, and the documentation links reference that can be really good for your report. It's both useful for knowing what's vulnerable on the understanding that's a very incomplete list. There's a number of takeovers that aren't added there because they can be quite dangerous for them to be listed publicly, and a number of takeovers that people keep private intentionally because they make significant money off it. In fact, I would say in terms of reports, there's more reports these days for services not on there than are, but one of the core reasons to reference this is to know what isn't vulnerable and the why. So if you saw in Akami, and typically they're referred to as dangling DNS records, if you saw an Akami dangling DNS record for the first time, then you would be wanting to know, hey, should I spend time looking into this? You can jump into here, see it's not vulnerable, and explore the why, and not retread the grounds others have followed, unless you read the discussion and you saw a new edge and you're like, oh, maybe this could be. So some exceptions there. Sometimes there's been situations, and so I do help maintain this repository, so I see a lot of these discussions, but there can be situations that come up on this repository where something's not vulnerable, but then an edge case arrives. So CloudFront, Amazon, initially, when they fixed it, they did this big push and they said, hey, we fixed it. But there were still some edge cases with older domains. So initially this repository went, okay, well, it's no longer vulnerable, and here's the Amazon publication. But then quickly it was discovered it wasn't, and there was a quick revert. And so it's worth seeing, when things have changed, the discussions, and kind of verifying for yourself, but it can really shorten that discovery phase. And likewise, you'll see some of them are listed as edge cases. So edge cases can be, some things to think of, like a company claims a domain, and so a certain subdomain is not vulnerable, but it will be vulnerable if they remove the whole domain from their account. So that would be a weird edge case that could impact certain services. Or say Fastly, for example, it could be that it's vulnerable until it's claimed in the account. There's a period of state where it could still be vulnerable in flux. And so really recommend another one to save, to become aware of. Don't just use subdomain takeover tools. Start to learn how to identify these for yourself. Personally speaking, I don't use a subdomain takeover tool. I use Dig, and I process results in scripts. I find it much more valuable, and a way of identifying new cases. There's a lot of great subdomain takeover tools, to be clear. There's a lot out there that, and a lot of authors in that space I respect. I'm not saying that they haven't done good work. It's a tough space. So like Subjack, for example, really great tool, really great approach. Done a really good job, but you're relying on the lists that are in there if you don't improve and increase on them, and learning the fundamentals of a subdomain takeover and learning what's in this list and creating your own baseline understanding of it does lead to much greater depth of results, and for a great many people is a cornerstone of their bug hunting in general, because if you do that and a lot of the crowd are then running Subjack and you have a takeover that's not in there, they might pass over it and miss it, where you can come behind, see something weird that's a dangling record, dig into it more, and end up having a finding that then you can search over other assets. So really recommend looking into that. Another one, and I'm not sure if this has got enough attention, or at least not as much attention as it deserves, is Cloudingo. So another area, not in the same realm as a subdomain takeover, but vulnerable cloud-based services, open S3 buckets. Now, they're a lot less common now, given Amazon's done a strong push to emailing people when they have an open bucket. They're no longer open by default, but there are still a lot of open S3 buckets out there. And in addition, Azure Storage, it still has its own issues as well. So what Cloud Enum aims to do is you feed it a word list crafted around the organization that you're searching for. So you might, and it creates permutations of that word list and does checks. You can see it's checking for Google buckets, and it'll check for Azure storage containers. It'll check for S3 buckets using that word. So if you have a more generically named program, like let's say you've got a program named 1337 XABCH, I'm just going for a random string, right? Something that's very unlikely to be in Google or to have other companies in the same space and reference, then that's a great thing to go and pass through this tool to look for instances that you may want to then explore further. Now, it may not find anything except for protected buckets. That could still be interesting to note because it tells you a little bit about the infrastructure that they're using. But it might find an open bucket, which then allows you to start exploring that and seeing if there's an impact behind it. But in essence, it's a really good tool for quickly passing over all three services instead of doing straight checks. And there are, I think Grey Hat Matter is the main one. There are services out there that you can pay to do checks over these services. This is free. It allows you to quickly check, and you can be quite clever with the word list. So when I check over these, I do tend to go to the domains I've found for an organization and look for unique instances or acquisitions and go searching there. And often I'll find things in this space in an acquisition where a company had been bought and it wasn't wound down completely, and there's still an open S3 bucket there. And even though Amazon might be triggering emails about it, they're not going anywhere because that organization has since been rolled up into another one. And there could be impact behind that you can leverage into a report. So strongly recommend adding this to your workflow. It's, even if you don't find anything, you've got a bit more satisfaction that you've covered that area. So, and if you're on a methodology-based test such as an NGPT, or you're on a penetration test, then this is very important to make sure that you do get full coverage. So that's the tools that I want to cover. I kind of want to cover my own methodology of, how do I find these things? How do I stay abreast of them? A large part is community, but there's some other things that I do as well that I think are worth adding into your workflow. I do tend to visit GitHub, at least once or twice a day. I have a lot of my own projects on there that I check in on, but I also like to go through the stream. So GitHub is a social network in itself, and I think that's underappreciated by a lot of people because they tend to go to repositories that are linked either through channels or Google. But if you set up an account, you can follow people, and then there's an all activity timeline that you can go to see what are other people starring or what are happening on projects. So you can watch projects as well. And so if you wanted like a bit of a seed list of authors that I think are valuable to this space, I've put a link to my following list there. There's a number of really decent authors. If you wanted a less noisy list, I'd suggest following people such as Tom Nom Nom, Albinawax, a lot of the people that you see releasing the tools within this talk, because they're likely to release future tools. There's a very active community there, and it's pretty rare that someone releases one thing and moves on. They tend to be exploring that further. So really recommend that. The two that I found most interesting to watch there, I'd say Tom Nom Nom and Iceman 543, two really good authors. Iceman 543, I tend to pick up a lot of his stars and follow them myself. Really, really good approach. And so that's, something you can do to see, where are other people looking and what are they looking at? And you may not adopt any of those projects, but you've got awareness of them to see if you want to adopt them later. So Find Domain, for example, was one that I kind of saw early on and didn't resonate with me early on. But later on when I saw, because I was watching the project, so you can also in GitHub go into a repository, put a watch on, and you'll get updates every time in notifications, not in the timeline, but in notifications, you get updates every time a issue is raised or a pull request goes in. And I was watching pull requests for a while and realized that it had matured and it was worth a fresh look. Likewise, for the FFUF project, I watch that one closely to see, new innovations that are being pushed out because it does move so quickly, and how can I adapt my workflow around these new things that are upcoming or that have just released. And so being active on GitHub is a really good cornerstone for increasing your workflow and elevating yourself, so you're kind of ahead of the curve before things become mainstream, which gives you an advantage, over the crowd that isn't doing that. Likewise, you shouldn't just adopt a tool because people are talking about it. So often something can get popular, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. There's some authors you'll see that are quite popular that aren't listed here, and that's not to say that I don't like them. I just don't think that their tools are the best for my workflow. Um, but on that note, like you should always dig in and see, has someone else done something that's maybe a little bit more tailored to the problem? And so for me personally, I tend to try and follow the Unix principle of find the tool that's trying to do one thing and do it well. I do tend to try and avoid tools that are trying to do everything because, being an author myself, I find that if I do one thing and I do it really well, then I'm fully understanding the problem and I'm fully diving into it. So, very sorry, I'm trying not to cough. So like FFuff has focused on fuzzing, and now it's extremely flexible for fuzzing, and you can use it for virtual host discovery, and you can use it for directory brute forcing, but at its core, it's just focused on being a fuzzing engine that does that really, really well. Likewise, find domain and subfinder have focused, on subdomain discovery and elimination of results, and they've avoided DNS brute forcing, which is, although a valuable addition to Amass, I feel also diverges from that core, fundamental thing that is allowing the other tools to get some of the other things right. So it's always worth looking at tools and going, well, what are they doing? Is there something that does this problem that I'm trying to solve better than this tool that's solving this problem with a heap of other things? Likewise, use time. So if you're not familiar with time, on the terminal, you can put the command time before any command to benchmark how long something takes to run. So if you're going to be running something at scale, like if I handed you 2,000 domains today and I said to you, hey, find every subdomain for this in an hour that you can, then you would want to time those tools to see which tool would be best suited to the task. And it's really useful to know the speeds and the depth of various tools for yourself, and revisiting that over time, because it is a shifting milestone. It does move quite a lot over time. I mean, SubFinder, the new release is exceptionally better than the old release. If you benchmarked it last year and you were indexing on those results and you haven't revisited this year, your perspective is way off than what it should be. So you do need to be regularly coming back to these checks. But just having that awareness of the tools and understanding your tool set allows you to refine those workflow decisions, in addition to knowing when you've discovered a new tool, if it is a better fit or not, because you know in depth what those tools are doing. And those are the things I would do beyond reading code. If you're capable of reading code, you should always do it. Some projects that have traction, and you dig into them, they do some pretty scary things that you wouldn't want to be doing. And some projects I've seen coming out lately rely on third-party services that you don't want hitting a domain, because a program could do a response at triage time, come back to us, being Bugcrowd or HackerOne, and querying why that third-party service has been used in that flow. And so you do need to be quite aware of, where the traffic flows are going, what's happening, and you get that awareness by looking into the code of service. So, and that'll help you to identify, what's truly passive, what's active, and knowing where you can apply what tool based on various scopes. And so I just want to touch on, this is a start to this talk. I'm going to continue this talk at RSA. So I'll be running a session during RSA week live from the Bugcrowd Lounge at Local Edition. You can register at the link really, really prominently highlighted above. And, I'm going to kind of take what I've talked about here. I'm going to talk about where the human interaction between these tools and having that human touch point is really valuable to the recon process, and where you do get that kind of fall down from these automated checks. So, as a point of example, like pointing a paid scanner, I don't want to call one out directly, but pointing a paid web scanner at a site, it's well understood that's not going to get the same results as pointing a crowd at it. And so, by the same notion, someone who's doing manual recon and going through and using all these tools is going to get a greater level of depth, because they can take a result and know where to expand and where not to. They don't have to have any rulings around scope. So I'm going to continue the conversation there. That's February 26th, and that'll be at RSA. I'm unsure if that'll be recorded or not. If it is, it'll be on the Bugcrowd channel. But yeah, so that'll be expanded there. Please do ask any questions you would like there using the link above. And so on that note, there is chat on this session. Please do ask any questions that you want to know. If I don't know them, I'll give you a reference point to kind of pull on from there. What are the notable changes coming up in 2020? It's still a new space. We're still seeing it. Already we've seen FFUF 1.0 release, which is great. And I've touched on that a lot. I really like that project. The other one, Subfinder, got a really big overhaul, and that looks to be continuing to iterate. And in addition to that, Find Domain has been iterating. So I think that'll be a competitive space again. Competitive in the sense that, when one tool improves, the other's encouraged to. It's a friendly competition in open source. It's never a malicious or like business sense one. So it's one where I feel we'll continue to see innovation, and we'll continue to see it evolving. Beyond that, it's still kind of yet to be seen. There tends to be something that happens midway through the year that kind of everyone starts to want to be doing by the end of it. So for last year, the API keys, for example, and then Albino Wax's, web cache deception and that kind of work really changed the game for a lot of people. And so we're going to hopefully have something similar again, right? But I would say space. I think we'll see something. Another question is, what projects are best to watch? I think FFUF is best to watch, as I touched on before, for knowing what's coming up, and then watching anything that you might have flagged. So if you follow a lot of authors, you might find something that isn't quite matured enough yet, but you want to watch it to future reference. So you might see, hey, there's a new Circle CI build log tool, but it's not complete and it's not released yet. You might watch that project. So as soon as it is, you know that you've got that in your toolkit and you can start to use it, or you might want to contribute to it as well. So I tend to watch things that are upcoming, not quite there yet, and watching like the staples in my workflow, things that I think I need to be aware of change, so I know whether to iterate and update my own version, or a feature that's coming down that I know I'm going to want to play around with and be aware of. And another one, if I want to contribute my own tool, where do I start? So GitHub can be a scary place to jump into. Personally speaking, as someone who maintains a lot of projects, I'm very open to any and all pull requests. I take spelling changes and improvements, whatever people come through, I'm happy to do. So it's a good area if you wanted to practice raising a pull request. Likewise, the Can I Take Over repository, you could improve the wording on there if you didn't know an area to change and contribute that way. Or you could contribute to key hacks. You could have an API check that you want to contribute to. Tool-wise, it's just about identifying a need in the space. So I kind of touched on, there's not something that really covers Circle CI yet. You might be someone who is aware of that and have the chops to deliver that. That's a great one to jump in and just put it out there. I'm really guilty of this, but I would say don't hold back from releasing just because you don't feel it's polished enough yet. The community is pretty receptive to ideas, less so than, hey, this is written with this great pattern and it's really polished and awesome. You can iterate on that once it's out there. I wouldn't use that as a barrier to a release and putting your work out. Personally speaking, I've got 3 projects now I've been meaning to release, but I keep wanting to polish. So I'm very good at giving that advice, very bad at following it. But I think it's important to not sit forever on a release if you're able to. But we're at time now, so I'm going to wrap it up. I'm very active in the Bugcrowd Discord. If you want to ask any additional questions there, it's a good chance to also mention that I do one-on-one training out of the Bugcrowd Discord. I tend to pick a random person every Friday. If I miss the Friday, I'll do the Monday. And just help them with these kind of workflows and approaches. So if you're not already active, I would strongly encourage joining us there. You'll be able to find invite links on Bugcrowd's Twitter or my own. It's a good space in general. Even if you're not someone I pick up for the one-on-ones, it's great to just to be in there, be active and learning, or even asking questions. If there's new tools, we tend to talk about it there. And on that note, thank you everyone, and I hope to talk to you again soon.